Alright, now usually they don't make tier lists that often, but here we've got something special. As you guys already know, Snake Eyes came into the game and just completely took over the meta. Also, I am only gonna talk about the best of the best decks. I'm not gonna go over some weird decks that could be rogue or not, because here I want to talk about something a little more serious. And of course, I'm gonna have to start with the elephant in the room. This deck absolutely took over the meta. Now, this isn't a tier 0 tab, but it's tier dangerous instead, which means that it's pretty close to becoming a tier 0 deck. And unless they limit the deck in a quick ban list or something, this will be absolutely devastating for the meta in Mass to do. So before I head into the analysis for the deck, I want to tell you that probably the second best deck is Branded Despia, and I want to show you something. Look at this. There are triple the players that play Snake Eyes compared to Branded Despia, and if you look at tournaments, there are most likely going to be a ton of Snake Eyes players, and the most tournament topping decks in terms of percentages and whatnot are going to be against Snake Eyes. Snake Eyes are just completely insane compared to anything else in the game, and there are two reasons for that in my opinion. Now, number one, it is a really hard deck to counter right now with hand traps and staples. Draw and Lockboard just doesn't get the job done because they can just set stuff on the field. Also, Nibiru doesn't get the job done exactly the right way because they can play around it. And also, even if you Nibiru them, they can still, capitalize sometimes depending on what they have in their hand. Ash Blossom ain't gonna cut it as well, and Maxi isn't enough in my opinion. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the best hand traps in my opinion to play are gonna be Effect Viewer, Imperm, or Ghost Bell, because these hand traps have the ability to stop not only the first effect of the Snake Eye monsters but also the second one, and Ghost Bell just negates the revival effects of something like Flameberg Dragon. And if the deck continues being that dominant, I would highly suggest to start playing these cards. Other decks have a really hard time actually stopping the deck, and I've played with Snake Eyes and also against Snake Eyes many times, and it's not easy. It's not easy dealing with the deck. There's definitely a problem going on here. It's just that the meta is just not ready for the deck yet. In my opinion, the meta needs to be power crept one step higher so it can actually compete with Snake Eyes, and this leads me to the only two ways in my opinion that you can actually make Snake Eyes a playable deck without it being broken. Now, the first step is obviously by a ban list. You need to ban/limit a couple of things, maybe Ash, maybe Poplar. You can do whatever you want, but you need to limit some of the cards in the deck to actually make it a little less good and a little, less consistent so that other decks can actually compete with it. And my second option that I would bring here would be to add more decks that are actually higher in power, which means that you need to add a couple of decks from the TCG that are currently, tournament topping as well, or are competing pretty well with Snake Eyes, but that will just change the meta completely and drastically, which is not something that Konami probably wants to do in the game. So in my opinion, the best way to fix things would be to just limit one or two cards in the deck just to make it a little less consistent. And by the way, if you're wondering why Snake Eyes became such a popular deck, it is because of the Poplar. They added Poplar to the game, which was really strong for the deck. And nobody expected Poplar to come that soon, because most people suspected that if Poplar comes into the game, it's gonna be a little too broken, and here we are. But anyways, I'm not gonna talk about only Snake Eyes. I want to also talk about some of the other decks, starting with Branded Despia. Now, this deck is really good. As you can see, it has been top tier for a very long time. Also, before Snake Eyes were added into the game, this was the best option for you to play, so that means a lot. Obviously, the deck is really competitive still, and I would highly suggest you play the deck if you're not playing Snake Eyes already, which I'm suspecting most people do, unfortunately. But yeah, Branded Despia is definitely a tier 1 deck. It is a really great option. Second best option in my opinion after Snake Eyes. So if you're not playing Snake Eyes, which most people do, you can consider playing something like Branded Despia if you want to compete with the meta. Speaking of good decks, there is also another deck that I want to talk about, and it is Super Heavy Samurais. Now, this deck used to be tier 1, now it is closer to tier 2 in my opinion, simply because it is a little bit easier to negate it. Obviously, Draw and Lockboard is a big deal for that deck, and it is easier to negate with Draw and Lockboard. And yes, you could go into Dagda or Baguska, but this doesn't fix the problem entirely. Also, Nibiru is a pretty big deal as well, that they can just Nibiru you before you can go into a Borneo floor, and there will be very rare occasions in which you're not going to be actually able to go into the Borneo floor without sacrificing the rest of your combos and making them worse just to play around Nibiru, which means that you're very rarely gonna play around Nibiru. Also, compared to Branded Despia and Snake Eyes, this deck has definitive weaknesses as to hand traps. Also, it has a really good choke point in the face of Wakaushi that you can just stop and limit your opponent's plays as well, which is a little bit of an issue as well. Also, Maxi is a pretty big deal. You're gonna give your opponent like 20 cards if you decide to play into it, while something like Branded Despia can play around the Maxi and just give a little less cards. Also, Snake Eyes can do a similar thing, not as good, but Snake Eyes are just really good anyway, so it doesn't matter if they're Maxi or not. But yeah, definitely Super Heavies are a little bit worse compared to the other decks here. I would say that they're definitely tier 2 in my humble opinion. Now, also another deck that I want to talk about is the Labyrinth deck, and in my opinion, this is down to tier 3. It used to be tier 2 for me for a very long time, but now I just don't think it can compete with decks like Branded Despia and also Snake Eyes. Also, a more controlled type of metagame is not the thing right now. Most decks are just going absolutely ballista, absolutely crazy, and Labyrinth it is just a little more slower of a deck, a little more grindy, which is just, it doesn't really fit the meta right now currently in my opinion, but it's still a decent option. Obviously it's not a bad deck to play. And another decent deck in my opinion is Rescue Ace, and this deck used to be really bad, but now with the release of the Diabilistar, also the Snake Eyes cards, it has become a little bit better in terms of consistency. Also with the new support it's gonna become even better, but even without the new support, in my opinion, it could be a tier 3 option, definitely not anything above that, but tier 3 seems like a fine option in my opinion. And I also tested the deck, played with it a little bit, and I definitely saw some potential there. Speaking of potential, a lot of people hated me in the comments below during the previous tier list because I put Mathmech in something around tier 3 to Rogue tier, and I was definitely wrong. This deck is actually better than that, and I think that I've learned my lesson now, and it is a tier 2 deck. It is definitely a really good option. I used to say that the deck is not that great, but now that I see it, I've played against it, I played with it a little bit as well, and I just saw some potential there, absolutely 100%. It is definitely a really good option to play in the meta. It can definitely compete with some of the other options. It has some weaknesses, of course, just like any other deck, but that is why it is tier 2. Obviously, anything above that, I can't do it. There is definitely no space for it being tier 1, but it is a tier 2 deck, and I definitely respect it now. And for our second to last deck, it is Vanquish Souls, and in my opinion, this deck used to be tier 2, but now it is tier 3. I just don't see it being that amazing anymore because it is more of a controlled style gameplay that just cycles through a bunch of resources, and in the grind game it is actually really good. But as I already said, there are decks that just go absolutely ballista and they just beat over you. For that reason, I just don't think that Vanquish Souls deserves to be better than tier 3. And the last deck that we've got here is Monadiums. Now unfortunately this deck didn't made it into the tier list, but I just decided to talk about it because it used to be a top tier deck in a lot of my tier lists. Back then it used to be like tier 2, tier 3, but now it is just nowhere near tier 3 in my opinion. It could be a rogue deck, but anything above that is gonna be too much to say. Now the main reason why I think that is because it is actually easier to negate it. It can be negated with Nibiru, it can be negated with Drone Lockboard. It is also not as good as some of the other combo decks right here, for example Super Heavy Samurais, and it just doesn't bring that much to the table compared to something like Snake Eyes, Branded Despair and whatnot. So yeah, even though I love the deck, I just cannot say that it's that good right now, and I'm sorry for all the Monadium players out there, but this is my opinion. I'm also a Monadium player, hey, but in my opinion it's just not one of the top tier decks in the meta currently. Now I hope you enjoyed the video, I hope you learned something, I hope I was helpful to you. Also, as I said, Snake Eyes are the biggest problem right here, and they need to do something about it, because if they don't, this is gonna become a tier 0 deck and it's not gonna be a fun time for anybody. But yeah, I guess we're about to find out. Now if you want to see more Yu-Gi-Oh! Mass Duel content, feel free to do that in the channel. Also feel free to like, subscribe, it will be greatly appreciated. And if you have any other questions about these decks or any other decks, let me know in the comments below. Also, if you don't agree with any of my decisions, let me know in the comments below as well. We can make a discussion about it. And of course, I will see you guys in the next video. Have a great day.